Would you trust me if I advised against using the Lightroom contrast slider? In this video, I'll show you why. I'll demonstrate how to implement more controlled tonal contrast using superior tools in Lightroom to create photographs with a more professional result. Additionally, there's a bonus tip on how to increase color contrast, as well as tricks to help your subject pop later on. Welcome to the channel, everyone. My name is Mark Dumbleton and I'm a professional wildlife photographer from South Africa. I publish videos every Sunday about all things relating to wildlife photography. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing to the channel. So firstly, why should we avoid the contrast slider? Let's jump onto the computer and I'll explain. In the basic panel in Lightroom, we are given this contrast slider. It's a basic contrast adjustment that gets applied to the entire image in a very set way. There's not a lot of customizing we can do to the contrast using this slider. As you can see, raising it up to 100 makes the bright areas very bright and the dark areas very dark. And going back to negative, you're reducing the contrast. Let's have a look at this image here. If I just apply this basic contrast, it doesn't give me the results I want. Those darks get very dark and the bright areas, I feel like they need to be brightened. But the problem here is I want to add a lot more mid-tone detail and I can't do that with this contrast slider. Now there is a much better way and a more controlled way to adjust contrast in an image, and that is to use the tone curve. The tone curve is incredibly powerful at adjusting contrast in different areas. So you can see this graph here. Now this is representing the tones in an image. So if I click onto this point curve and adjust the curve, I'm adjusting the brightness values of different tones in the image, allowing me to fine-tune the contrast. Again, on this example, I can click on this curve here and adjust different parts of the image to achieve the result that I want. But after that quick introduction to the tone curve, I want to show you how I work contrast into an image. I normally start with the profile. Choosing different profiles here will render slightly different results, but I always choose Adobe Standard as a good starting point. Now, what I like to do in my images is I like to soften the shadows and then raise the contrast in the highlights. So let's go through this image and just adjust the contrast. I'm going to drop the exposure down a little bit and I'm going to raise the blacks. What that's going to do is going to soften those dark tones in the image, and then I bring in the contrast with the white slider here. So basically, if you think of the exposure as adjusting your midtones and the blacks as obviously the blacks, and then using the whites to bring in that highlight contrast there. So I normally start with quite a contrasty image, and then what I would do next is go into the tone curve. Now the tone curve gives us quite a few options. It gives us a parametric curve and a point curve, and also RGB curves, which I won't really go into on this video, but I will show you the parametric curve here and the point curve. So the parametric curve is a simplified version of the tone curve. It allows you to adjust different areas on the image here. So you can see I've got a shadows, darks, lights, and highlights slider to use. So simply dragging those down or up will increase the brightness in those areas. So you can really adjust a more customizable contrast across the whole image. So I'll just reset that out and then show you the point curve. Now this is usable in two different ways. You can click on the point curve, or you can actually use the small eyedropper tool here by clicking that, and you can actually go across to a specific part of the image, click and drag, and you'll see it'll adjust and create a point on the curve for that tone. So if I click and drag onto a darker tone here, you'll see it's adding that point there. Now I don't like using this eyedropper tool that much. I prefer to manually adjust the points on the graph. So I will reset that there. And this is how I go about doing it. It's a lot of experimenting to come up with the look that you want. Again, I don't like too much contrast in my shadows, and I like to roll the blacks off. I don't like having anything too dark, too black in my images. I like to keep those shadows a lot softer, and then pump up those highlights to bring in that nice highlight contrast there. So as you can see, there's a million different ways you could customize the contrast. There's no limit as far as I know as to how many points you can put on this curve. Now I'm liking the look of that. I think I just want to drop the exposure and then I think flatten out more of those dark tones. I'm gonna raise up this point here and then maybe just flatten out those shadows a bit. Maybe raise up the midtones slightly. Now the beauty of the tone curve is you're able to add it onto a mask. So I'm just going to reset this curve here. I'm going to create a subject selection. I'll just clean this subject selection up very, very quickly here. Take away that. And then just add brush onto the leg. Just like that. What I like to do is add contrast to my subject and then remove contrast from the background. So just a quick couple of tweaks here. Just add maybe a nice brightening effect there on that point. And then what I will do here is duplicate this mask and invert it to select the background. Then go down to the point curve and just raise up the shadows and drop those highlights just to make it a bit softer. And then one neat trick you can actually do here is go to the dehaze and actually add some negative dehaze. That's going to soften that background a little bit. And this works really well if you've got a very nicely diffused background, if you've shot the image at a very wide aperture. And then I'm going to use a linear gradient here. I'm just going to drop down the exposure on this foreground and then just drop some contrast there and maybe just add a little bit of brightening effect on the bottom. So a nice way to add some color contrast and not so much tonal contrast is to use this neat little trick that I like to use. It's a white balance increase across the whole image, which then allows us the opportunity to add some nice cooling to the shadows. This creates a little bit of color contrast across the image. And you can actually then darken the image a little bit more with this slider here, the luminance slider. And then with the balance slider, I'm going to throw those shadows into very specific areas of the image. Now to finish this image off, I'm going to adjust the hue of this lion's fur. Might add in some more color grading, just to drop those shadows into more of a blue color. And I want to just go in and adjust the eyes. The eyes are very, very dark here. Just going to use a brush on the eye there. Increase the exposure. Don't want it to look too unrealistic, but I feel like it definitely needs brightening in that area. And I might throw just a soft radial gradient on the face just to increase that exposure very, very slightly. Might add a vignette to the image. And then just throw on some clarity. Now clarity is also another way of adding contrast, which I will explain in a future video. So I think I would finish off the image something like that. If you're looking for further editing ideas to spark creativity, check out this video next, where I share the techniques I use to create a moody and desaturated look for my wildlife photographs in Lightroom.